So, Barbara, thank you so much for coming on here this afternoon. I am working on a Substack piece about the issue of medical aid in dying. I have uh, received one interview from someone who's on the other side of the issue. He's a book author by the name of Chris Palmer. He's written a book called Achieving a Good Death, and he's more on the right to die side of things. So I'd like to get perspective from you on your views here. I see that you've been kind of in the public policy space for about 4 decades, and you're heavily involved in this issue on the other side of it. And I would like to first find out how you became involved with the work that you are currently doing.
So I became interested in this issue just out of concern that people at the end of life would face discriminatory practices, and it, there would be a distortion of the practice of medicine for patients if the option of death were part of the package that they were offered at the end of life. And so it was a sincere desire of mine, plus the fact that I was involved in caregiving for many years with my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and then again with my husband. And so the issue was of great interest to me for that reason.
I see.
I would just like to add that before we go any further, that medical aid in dying is a made-up term that does not have any value in both in the legal context or in the medical context. Laws that prohibited assisted suicide have been those. They prohibit assisted suicide that are in existence in the various states. And the American Medical Association studied the terminology and decided that medical aid in dying was so broad that it could encompass both palliative care and euthanasia. And so they stated that physician assisted suicide is the proper term to use in discussing the topic. So we always call it assisted suicide or physician assisted suicide, which is what it is. Medical aid in dying is just kind of a made up term that was probably focus group to essentially influence public opinion. So I wanted to make that clear. And the AMA is very clear on their position that it is not, within the medical context, it is not a proper term. And again, within the legal context, it is not a proper term.
As I was reading up some information online about the AMA's position, and my take is that they're opposed to this whole issue, even though you have doctors in certain states. I know there are 13 states in the District of Columbia that have now authorized this practice. Is this something that the AMA opposes in principle and is just letting doctors in those states just use their conscience accordingly?
Pretty much, I would say that's correct. But the official position of the organization, which was reestablished in 2019 and again overwhelmingly verified last June, as being opposition to the practice of physician assisted suicide.
So then you're saying the term medical aiding dying, maybe it's a sanitized way of referring to assisted suicide, or whether it's a physician assisted suicide or assisted suicide, maybe with help from nurses. Are they
Correct.
now involved
That's
with that
correct.
too?
That's correct.
Okay. How does the medical aid in dying, physician assisted suicide, however you term it, how does this affect the doctor-patient relationship? And does it violate that relationship?
I think it puts the relationship in question because as a patient, now, for example, I'm just going to take myself, someone like myself. If I'm going to a physician to essentially learn what perhaps what illness I have and what my options are, it's very disturbing to me to think, well, one of the options might be in the back of my physician's mind that they don't think that my life is any longer of any value, so they would suggest assisted suicide. So it certainly disrupts that particular relationship, I think, in a very, very major way. And it distorts the practice of medicine in that medicine is always thought to have been a healing, when possible, do no harm practice. And now all of a sudden you're introducing drugs that, when prescribed in a huge, I mean, enormous amounts, are geared to cause a patient's death rather than to preserve the patient's life, or at least just keep the patient comfortable. So I think it's a big distortion both in the practice of medicine itself, and that consequently then goes to the doctor-patient relationship.
Is there such a thing as a good death versus a bad death? And is there something about death with dignity? Is that also a term that some say might sanitize the issue or whitewash it?
Yeah, I mean, death with dignity can mean many different things. It's not particularly enlightening in terms of what it means. And I agree with you. I agree with what you described it as a sanitized method of talking about. And I don't even know what it talks about, because I think we would all like to have a dignified death, but it can mean many, many different things. It can mean receiving comfort care, palliative care, to the extent that you are not in any anguish or pain at the time of your death, and you can die a very comfortable death in that particular way. So again, that's why I think terminology is important, and for the purpose of your piece, I think it's important that it be described in a way that is the most descriptive way for people to understand, rather than them having to say, well, what is death with dignity? And when I was medical aid in dying, does that include palliative care? Does that include hospice care? Does that include euthanasia? So I think that being very specific is the best way to go.
Okay. What are other concerns of your organization, as well as those of people, say, who have disabilities, people who are minorities, or maybe people who grew up in a time when the system was stacked against them? I mean, we hear of cases of minorities who were experimented on, I should say, without their knowledge. Are you concerned that this is where we're headed again?
It's not where we're headed, it's where we are.
Okay.
I think that, again, you essentially establish a system whereby, and maybe not outright coercion, but pressure, either subtle or more extreme, financial concerns, those types of things all of a sudden enter the picture, instead of what is best for the patient and what is the best for either their care or their comfort. So you essentially invite a system of pressure and abuse for some of our most vulnerable patients. And we do have examples of that. I'm going to give you two examples right away. There was a young woman named Jane Allen in Colorado who had anorexia, a very, severe case of anorexia. But anorexia is not a terminal illness. Yet there's a physician in Colorado that has come up with a new term called terminal anorexia, which again did not exist in the medical lexicon until she made it up, because she wanted to have the ability of prescribing lethal drugs to her patients with anorexia. So Jane Allen did, in spite of her debilitated state, when you have anorexia and you're so deprived of food, you can barely think and focus, let alone make concrete decisions. She was given a prescription for lethal drugs. And her father immediately got into the situation, and he filed for guardianship, and a court granted him guardianship. So what a doctor said was her ability to make a decision such as this, the court said no, she didn't, and gave guardianship to her father. And he consequently took the drugs and destroyed them. And Jane actually recovered for a considerable amount of time and was able to reestablish good eating habits. She found a job, she had pets, found new friends, and she did eventually succumb to this extended period of time of being without nutrition. But at least it was a death of a natural cause rather than her being subjected to this massive amount of drugs. The other person I'm going to talk about is Melissa Ortiz. This is a woman who lived in Washington, D.C., where assisted suicide was legal. Actually, for Jane, it was also legal in Colorado. This was a woman that lived in Washington, D.C., lifelong wheelchair user. And she suffered just a whole list of traumatic conditions, sepsis, and a number of things in the hospital. And she was literally told that she would not live much longer. She was given a terminal prognosis. And so she's trying to assimilate the fact that she's going to die, because that's what they told her. Her husband had left. She was alone in her hospital room. And a nurse came in late at night, dark in the room, and, well, have you ever thought about assisted suicide? In other words, suggesting it to her at a time when she was feeling very vulnerable and alone. And Melissa at least had enough of wherewithal to know that this was not something that was right. And she just asked this nurse to leave. But you can see how it can prey on vulnerable people at a time when they are, again, experiencing even more vulnerability. Melissa actually recovered. She's still alive today, owns her own business. And so it was a bad diagnosis that someone tried to take advantage of, and she would not be alive today if she had not had the wherewithal to know that this was not something that was right. So those are the types of situations that we're concerned about. There are also concerns about people, family members that want to be financially rewarded by the patient's death. I know a lot of these laws are written with saying that it cannot be someone that has a person who has part of the individual's estate cannot be a witness. They just call a friend in and say, "Oh, Jane, I can't witness this. Can you witness it for me?" There's so many ways to get around these supposed safeguards that they put in the laws. So the safeguards, guardrails, whatever you want to call them, are basically meaningless because there are always ways to get around them. Particularly if someone is motivated, they don't want to take care of this person any longer. They can be financially rewarded, and the list goes on and on and on. I think that in terms of people with disability and people that in minority status too find the same thing. They feel that the medical establishment is stacked against them. And in fact, with the disability population, there was a very good study done out of Harvard just a few years ago, in which the researcher found that 82.4% of physicians stated that they felt that the life of a person with significant disabilities was much less valuable than someone who had no disabilities. So again, you're setting up a situation where if you think this, if you're the person in power, which is the medical profession, and you think this person's life has no value, then it's easier to suggest, and you might think you're doing it out of compassion even, to suggest something like, well, maybe you should just not be living anymore at all because you're suffering and so on and so forth. So it sets up a system that really pits the patient against the medical profession, and I think in a very unhealthy way. So those are most of the reasons why we're concerned about these types of laws that put people at risk that should not be put at risk in these situations.
And what about the elderly?
Well, the elderly would be in the same, really in the same category as people with disabilities and people from minority populations, in that they may be facing a medical profession that is not, again, out of maybe what they think is compassion, not think that a person that's older has a good life, and so that this might be a good suggestion for them. So I think elderly at risk, patients with dementia are at risk. Now, none of the laws that are in place right now allow assisted suicide for patients with dementia, but there are some that want to have that happen, or at least they want to, for example, allow a patient in the earliest stages of dementia, when they still have some ability to make a decision, to be able to say, down the line, I want to have assisted suicide drugs. Again, I want to be careful with that because none of the laws suggest that right now. It's just something that possibly is in the future. So I want to be really careful about that. Because the laws that are in place call for self-administration of the drugs, it would be very difficult for a person with advanced dementia to be able to take the drugs. But there is one case that was written up in the literature. It was a woman with dementia, early dementia. And what she did was that she stopped eating and drinking. And because she was not taking in nutrition and hydration, she became eligible for the drugs because she was now in a terminal condition. And she did take the drugs. And so that was a way of getting around. It's kind of like a workaround the laws. Again, as I said, the supposed safeguards and so on are pretty meaningless because there's so many ways to get around them.
And how long do these drugs take to work? Is it a matter of minutes? Is it hours? Is it days?
So the latest Oregon report has, let me just get it out here so I make sure I get it. The range of time was 1 minute to, I think it was 137 hours. I want to make sure I have that 137 hours straight. So it can take a very long time. And I mean, that's just another issue. Yeah, 1 minute to 137 hours. So that's another issue, in that the drugs themselves are massive amounts. I mean, like 1,000 times the amount of a drug you would take, for example, diazepam, something like the very common drug for relaxation. And they're very experimental. essentially what has happened is that proponents have devised these, they call drug cocktails. Well, let's try these 4 medications in massive doses and see what happens. Well, that didn't work so well. So let's adjust this drug and put this one in. There's no oversight to this. There's no independent review board that's looking at these medications to see how their impact on patients, to evaluate them. And it seems like every time we get a new report, well, let's take that drug out and put this one in. So the drugs are very experimental in nature in terms of, again, no review of them, no overview of how these are being concocted and given to patients. There are complications with the drugs. They can, in some instances, seizures or vomiting or those types, or a choking could occur from these drugs. So they're not totally harmless, let's put it that way. And again, extremely experimental.
There are some people who say, well, this is bodily autonomy. It's a matter of choice. What do you say to them?
So while that could be true, you don't know if that choice is freely made, first of all. It could be extreme pressure. It could be an abusive situation. So there's that, is this really a choice that the person has made? But I think the main thing that has to be said is that by allowing a certain group of people this choice, what you're doing is essentially setting up a system of pressure, coercion, and abuse for another larger group of people that may not have a good outcome from the fact that this is now legal. So again, you set up a whole series of events that doesn't impact just that one person, but impacts classes of people. But the classes of people, to me, of most concern are those with disabilities, minority populations, and of course, older people.
And what shifts are you seeing regarding public acceptance of this issue? I mean, with 13 states and the District of Columbia authorizing medical aid in dying / assisted suicide, what is your concern there?
So the poll data is supposedly favorable. But when you ask a question that says, do you think people should be able to have a doctor's assistance to die a peaceful death? Well, I mean, you can see where, and variations of that question, you can see where the numbers go up. I would say that the thing that's essentially propelling the issue in terms of legalization is that you'll find like examples of patients in like, let's just say the state of Illinois, which just legalized recently. Family members come forward and say, oh, my sister, brother, mother, grandfather died a terrible death, and this is a way to give them a peaceful death. And that argument has weight, except when you start examining all the pitfalls and the experimentation of the medication and the fact that you're setting up a system that could be disadvantageous to a larger population of vulnerable people. So those situations become quite emotional. And I don't want to say you essentially are not getting the correct explanation of what happened to your relative, sister, brother, and so on, because I don't think that's fair. I think people's experiences are the experiences, and we're all subjective and we view them in different ways. For example, my husband and I took care of my mother-in-law and father-in-law. My father-in-law had dementia. We viewed him as a very, very sweet and dear man who we gladly took care of for the 4 years that he had dementia. Other people would say, oh, he's not the same person, and he's not himself. And it's so subjective on how you look at people. That was our experience with it. Someone else could look at that same individual and say, well, he didn't have any value at all. Look at him. He didn't recognize anybody. He just was not the same person anymore. I've had people tell me, oh, he's a different person. Well, he wasn't a different person to us. He was the same dear father-in-law in a different state in his life. And so that does essentially sway how you look at people that are in these situations. So again, everybody's situation is subjective, and I think it's important to understand that.
So, what about people who say, well, I'm in pain, I have a terminal illness, I'm going to move from a state where this is illegal to a state where it's legal, like, say, Oregon or maybe New York when it goes into effect, or Illinois?
Well, let's address the pain issue first. No one wants to be in pain. and no one wants their loved one to be in pain. And I think it's important to note that there have been a lot of advancements in good palliative care that have decreased instances when someone has to be in a lot of pain. And there's also something called palliative sedation, where you can essentially sedate the person to the point where they don't feel pain, but you're not causing their death. So there are antidotes to the pain argument. In terms of moving to a different state, well, that causes a lot of problems. So right now, 2 states have no residency requirements, Oregon and Vermont. So let's say that I'm in Wisconsin, which is where I live, and I decide I'm going to go to Oregon for assisted suicide. Well, first of all, when I get there, it's not my physician that's going to assess my situation. It's someone that's never met you before. They might have some medical records. They look at that. It's, what is it, a half-hour evaluation? I don't know, not very long. And then this person is going to prescribe you these lethal drugs, which you have to have the prescription filled in Oregon because you can't get it filled back in Wisconsin where you live. And so what does that person do then? Do they sit and wait for months in Oregon so for the time when they want to take the drugs? Or do they take them back to Wisconsin where it's illegal and then create a new situation back in the sponsoring state? And there's not been a good answer to that. And if you look at the Oregon reports, they'll say that so many patients, there are this number of patients that came from out of state and received the prescription for the lethal drugs. But we have no idea what happened because we don't know where they went and where they took the drugs and so on. So we can't give you an accurate report on what happened. So it's clear that they don't even know what's happening once that person travels to the other state. So there are a lot of problems involved in that. And I know that there was a court, so there was proponents have gone to court in several states to try to force a residency, to eliminate the residency requirement. It was in New Jersey where they went to court and the judge said, no, I'm not going to grant this because the law that was passed had a residency requirement. I'm not going to grant it because it puts physicians in other states where the drugs might be taken at risk because they can't be a valid prescriber. In other words, he was recognizing that the relationship of the states where it's legal and not legal is disrupted by the fact that you don't know where the drugs are being taken.
How long does it take from the time a doctor writes the prescription to the time when a pharmacy fills it? And what if the pharmacist says, I'm not filling this because my conscience will not allow me to do that?
Okay, so that's almost like 2 different issues. So almost every state that initially passed a law had a waiting period, so that you asked for the drugs and then a certain period of time had to elapse before the prescription was written. And it was initially 15 days. Now, a number of states that have legalized have come back and said, oh, that was terrible. It was a barrier. So we want shorter waiting periods or no waiting periods. Or we want to at least be able to waive a waiting period if it looks like the person's going to die within a few days. So a lot of the states have done that. And so the waiting period, and then a lot of the prescriptions are written and the pills are never taken. So there's a big percentage, I think it's something like 30% are not even taken at all. And so from what I understand, at least in some of the states, from what I've read, is that they write the prescription, but then the drugs are held at the pharmacy so that they're not floating around somewhere in someone's house. Well, they may wait 4 months to decide whether or not they want to take them. So I think it really varies. And I don't think that you can just say, well, this is exactly what happens in every state and every situation. So that's the issue of when the prescription's written, when it's taken, and so on. In terms of conscience, most of the laws that are written do not really, they essentially say that you have a conscience protection, but that they don't really allow the conscience protection. So you don't have to be involved, but you have to refer, you have to pass records or whatever. So there have been some court cases there where, for example, in California, their lack of conscience protection was taken to court, and the court decided that physicians could be protected. How pharmacists are involved in that is, I think, a little murkier because most of the laws are written around physicians and not pharmacists. So that's a little bit murkier, and I honestly can't tell you for sure how that works.
What about insurance companies, life insurance companies, or even regular medical insurance companies? And what about Medicare, Medicaid? Where do they stand on the issue? Does a life insurance company, say, pay out a certain amount of money after a couple of years that you say if somebody took out a policy with this kind of a rider in it?
Okay, so that's like three different things. So I'm going to take them one by one. Okay.
Sure.
So in terms of payment for the drugs, there is a federal law that goes back to 1989, I believe it is. The AFSRA, the Assisted Suicide Federal Restriction Law. So their federal funds cannot be used for the drugs, period. So then that means that the state can pay for them or the person's personal insurance company can pay for them, which is pretty much what happens since the federal government can't. But there's a new, it just gets so complicated. There's a new study going on at the federal level right now. We just supplied commentary on it as to whether or not hospices are keeping those funds separate. In other words, in these types of cases, if they're prescribing the lethal drugs, are they keeping the federal funds separate from the state funds? So I'm going to set that aside now. The law says the federal funds shouldn't be used. So states are using them and insurance companies are paying for them, private insurance companies. In terms of Medicaid, that's a real problem because Medicaid is a joint state and federal paid program. And so that's one of the issues they're studying right now is have they been properly separated? So the Medicaid issue is kind of up in the air right now based on that. In terms of life insurance, all of these laws are written in such a way that it says that a life insurance company cannot withhold a life insurance payment if the person takes assisted suicide drugs.
Okay. What about cases where people are in a persistent vegetative state and they can't think for themselves?
They're not eligible.
Okay.
They're just not eligible.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to add today on this issue, Barbara? And what else is your organization doing to, say, stop legislation from getting to a governor's desk?
Okay, so first of all, we filed 5 lawsuits in California, Colorado, Delaware, Illinois, and New York. The Illinois and New York cases were just filed 3 weeks ago, essentially challenging the constitutionality of their laws legalizing assisted suicide. And the basis of our challenge is that the prescribing of these drugs is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Because by description in the ADA, a person that is in a terminal condition fits the description of a person with a disability. I'm simplifying this for you, but that's okay. And then we also are claiming that it violates various aspects of the federal constitution. We have California is on appeal, Delaware is on appeal. Colorado has done nothing with their case, and Illinois and New York were just filed. So that's one of the things we're doing. In terms of activity in the states, we have a very strong effort going where we build coalitions in the various states. They're very, very diverse. They have people from all ends of the political spectrum, from the very progressive to the very conservative, and they all work together on this one issue to achieve a goal that is one that we want to achieve. And so we work with these coalitions and we do things like provide testimony at public hearings, organize people, do messaging training, follow the legislative process, help people lobby with legislators, put together resource materials, all the types of things you would do with a coalition. So that's a very strong part of what we do. We have coalitions in every state. Most states, and especially we have a coalition in states where laws have been proposed. So.
Okay. Very good. Well, this is certainly one of those issues that people will be talking about for some time. I mean, it's
right.
not going away.
The only other point I would like to make is that whether or not these laws are proposed and passed with good intention, they're never good enough, so to speak. So there have been, in many of the states, in fact, almost in most of them, they come back with expansion laws. Well, now we want nurse practitioners to prescribe. Now we want to reduce waiting periods. Now we want to remove residency requirements and so on. So between expansion bills and court action and just plain interpretation, they're constantly working to expand the practice. And by interpretation, I'm taking into account something like that all of a sudden inventing this term terminal anorexia so that you can fit the action to what you want it to be rather than what was written into the law. Because there's no way these laws were written to include anorexia. And yet we have good examples in Colorado and California where young women with anorexia have been given lethal drugs and they've died. And I think that's, again, an expansive interpretation of the law. So when they talk about how great the safeguards are and there are no abuses and it works extremely well in every single case, first of all, it's not believable in any way. They're not taking into account these types of situations where people that aren't really dying are getting the drugs and so on. And then there's the example of the woman with early stage dementia who essentially created a terminal condition for herself so she could receive the lethal drugs. And they're calling that a bridge, a bridge. And there's no question that they want to expand the practice. There's no question about it. There are articles written all the time about, we really should have it include this. And why is it a 6-month diagnosis? Why can't it just be any amount of time? Why can't it be this? Why can't it be that? So there's a constant effort to expand the practice once you get the law in the books. So I just want to make that very, very clear.
You see this going as far as the Supreme Court someday?
Well, we're essentially, we're on record publicly. That's what we're doing with our court cases. We want them to get to the Supreme Court.
Okay. Barbara, I appreciate your time today on what is a very tough issue, and
It is a tough issue.
and I thank you so much for your perspective.
Candace, thank you so much. And I hope that you will send me a copy of your article once you write it.
Yes, I will.
I just thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate the ability to essentially educate on this side of the issue.
Thank you so much, and you have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.